Sara Hagemann, Assistant Professor here at LSE in the European Institute. It would be true to say, wouldn't it, that Europe has a constitution and Britain, looking for a written constitution, need look no further. There is one, it just is a small part of it rather than the whole thing. Would that be right? Does it have a written constitution, Europe?
We don't have one single document that we can point to and say that that's the constitution, but we have a number of treaties, and then of course all the legislation that comes from the EU, all of that together can be said to be a constitution in the same form as we see it at the national level. But there was an attempt to try and put everything together into one constitutional treaty, but that was rejected, obviously.
What went wrong with it, do you think? Was it too grand a claim for nation states?
I think that people have very strong feelings when it comes to such important documents as a constitution, and rightly so. And the debate about a constitution is very complex, and I think that people reacted at the time to a project that they didn't see as theirs. The attempt that was made was to have a convention with representatives from many different parts of society and from all over Europe, but it was very much a political project, absolutely.
In some ways, a constitution should be simple. It shouldn't be a technical thing. You've got some bunch of people who need to make laws. You've got a bunch of people who need to make those laws real, executive, and you've got another lot, the referee, comes along and adjudicates. Now, legislative, executive, judicial are the sort of fancy words to describe that.
Yeah.
But Europe seems to mix those up apart from the judicial. So it's created a kind of rod for its own back in terms of how complicated it is, hasn't it?
Yes. I think that all of these, this kind of division of labour that you also have at national level, that's still developing at the European level, absolutely.
Let's get it sort of clear in my head before we talk about the national picture.
Yeah.
The easy ones are the Commission, the European Commission, much maligned, much hated, bureaucracy, etc. among Eurosceptics in the United Kingdom. It generates policy and implements laws. Would that be it more or less? The European Commission.
The Commission proposes, so it drafts a proposal and puts it to the European Parliament and to the Council, where the ministers from national ministries, they meet. And they then negotiate on this proposal and come to some agreement, and that becomes law. Of course, you can talk about the EU institutions dominating the process, but the national bureaucracies, the national politicians, they're the ones who decide on the legislation and ultimately also are important in making them, realizing them in the implementation.
Right. So it's not a normal constitution because the legislative dimension is shared between this directly elected European Parliament and also all the various ministers who represent the various countries who meet and agree things with that lot. Well, so that's a national dimension in the heart of the EU.
You can compare it to a bicameral system where you have one chamber made up of the ministers and one chamber made up of a parliament, the European Parliament. And between them they have, so that's an executive and the parliament coming to agreements on policies. So what is usually a big sort of puzzle to people is that, so you have a council where the ministers meet, but you're not quite sure what goes on in those meetings.
They're not public, are they? They're not televised?
They are starting to be public, and we have more and more like decision records and even votes taking place in the council. But it used to be a club almost of important ministers coming together.
Are these the guys who used to go into a room and at 4 o'clock in the morning they come out and say, we got a fantastic deal for fill in the blank?
We see a lot of, like, people call it like corridor bargaining, and that things are done, you know, there's a lot of trading, like if I receive some concessions on one policy, I might give you something else on another policy. So there's a lot of that going on.
But the answer would be to have more, I mean the buzzword is transparency, but let's call it a straightforward word, would be have more openness, where people could know exactly what's going on. But I guess the politicians would say, oh, we need a bit of privacy or we'll get nothing done.
Well, we are starting to see some new steps in the direction of opening up, and it's mainly because also the politicians now, they recognize that the EU has a democratic deficit, as they call it, that there is this distrust from the populations of what goes on in Brussels. And one way to overcome that is obviously to give a better insight into what is being negotiated and what is being decided. But also it's interesting because it becomes more and more clear that what happens in Brussels actually affects people's life on a day-to-day basis. At the moment, there's a big case going on about the free trade agreement with the US.
And that's an EU free trade, not a UK agreement, is it?
It's a EU, but something that the UK is very interested in. There's a lot of stakeholders in the UK who watch this very, very closely because, of course, a free trade agreement from Europe with the US is something that the UK export and trade will be extremely affected by.
So if the UK were negotiating with the United States on its own, the United States may say, well, look, for heaven's sake, we're not going to waste time with you guys. Where's Europe? But if they negotiate through Europe, the UK mightn't get all that it wants. It has to do a preliminary trade before it does the trade with the United States.
The UK, if it was to say, well, we are going to do our own kind of agreement with the US, that will be of less interest to the US, of course. But I think that the UK plays an enormously important role in anything that has to do with the internal market and trade agreements, absolutely, in Europe. And I think that the UK, by many continental partners, will be seen as one of the leaders in this debate.
If you look at it from a United Kingdom point of view, people who care about this country, who see it as an independent country and so on, and then you look at parliamentary proceedings, so much of it is about one of the functions you mentioned earlier, executing the decisions in the European Union. And you do wonder sometimes whether or not it might be a very small percentage of things that the British Parliament debates that are British. So maybe the right to die here, or sort of an occasional thing about gay marriage there, or perhaps an involvement in some Commonwealth issue. But the big stuff is now really driven by Europe.
Well, I think Europe, but also globally. I mean, I think that we can talk about, of course, a Europeanization of things, but it's all about also what's happening at the global stage. And it would be quite a step back for any parliament to all of a sudden say that, well, we're only going to debate what happens within our borders, because obviously borders at the moment, they're a very fluid thing.
Well, supposing our lot, the people who are drafting our constitution, supposing they voted up an article. The United Kingdom is a sovereign, independent state which shall transfer none of its sovereignty to any international or regional body. And this got through, we'll say. Is it a simple matter to leave the European Union? Are there European rules about leaving the European Union?
There are no such rules for what a member state was to do if it decided to leave the Union. But I have to say, I would actually put the question back to those people and ask them, if you were to make such a decision, it's completely within your rights. But what do you mean by sovereignty? What is it you want to hold on to? Because I think that if you are living in a society like we are today, things are, as I said, much more fluid beyond the borders. So it will be very difficult to say that we can just close those borders and have control of everything on our territory, but not care about what happens outside our little territory.
Yeah. Using the word little there to diminish this great isle of ours.
I mean, I'm from Denmark. I'm from a very small country.
And I'm from Ireland, two tiny places.
Yeah. So I think that whichever country we look at in Europe is very little when we look globally.
I suppose the answer on the sovereignty point is to distinguish between legal sovereignty and political sovereignty. Wearing my slightly anorak legal hat for a minute, it's a straightforward matter. Sovereignty is entirely with Parliament, which is the Queen in Parliament, and they could actually, in legal theory, legislate. One of the best examples they use in class is to ban smoking on the streets of Paris, because Parliament is sovereign. And then you could arrest any French person who is in Britain on the basis that they might have smoked in Paris. We can do what we want. Now, in a similar way, the 1972 British parliamentary law, which leads to our belonging to Europe, could simply be repealed. There could be a repeal here straightforwardly, and that would be that. Parliament is sovereign. But that's legal sovereignty. And the question you raise is about political or economic sovereignty. And there, Britain is not master of its own destiny in the way that it is in law.
Well, it could make the attempt to try and make such a line again and say that, well, we only want to be concerned by British matters.
Yeah.
But yes, I would question whether that indeed is really what people would want and if it's in their interest, because if the UK was to leave the EU, any kind of continued trade agreements that was then made with Europe, that obviously they would have to comply with EU law that the UK had no influence on.
Oh, because the EU would say, right, as they do perhaps with Norway, they say, right, if you're going to send stuff into our place, you can't cheat by having slave labour. You have to do the same things, and not only that,
well,
with health and safety and so on.
They do that with any trade partners. So, you know, with the example of Norway, as you say, you have a huge amount of legislation in Norway that is not decided by the Norwegian Parliament, but is simply because it has to comply with the standards set from the EU.
So if we didn't want to do that in Britain, if we wanted to have economic sovereignty, we'd need to not send our stuff to continental Europe and Ireland.
Yes.
So that'd be a bit of a tricky problem, wouldn't it?
I think so, yes.
Because they're not about to allow us to negotiate some special deal where we miss out on bureaucracy and red tape.
Well, we have to remember that all the legislation that goes through the European Parliament and the Council is something that UK politicians sign up to. If they're not on board, then in most cases it would not go through. I would say 90% of the legislation that comes from Brussels is something that the UK has actively said, we agree to this.
Why doesn't the British government, we'll say, and you know about the British government, you study all this in Europe and have been involved, I think, with the Foreign Office, why don't the ministers boast about the extent of influence they have in Europe?
Well, because it's a funny love-hate relationship with Brussels, because you see that there's a lot of very good things that the governments actively can achieve at the EU level, but they'd rather, of course, say that, you know, they take the credit themselves. Whereas anything that is unpopular legislation to pass through is something that they can say, well, Brussels did this.
And in the same way they can blame the European Court of Human Rights for something.
Yes, exactly.
What would a post-European Union Britain look like? We'll say 5 years down the line. Describe to me this country, and then it's put in place its own migration controls, and it's stopped with this European trade with all these European demands. What kind of a place would it be, in your opinion?
Well, there's a lot going on in Europe at the moment, like also in Greece, so we might see things happening before the UK come to a point where it wants to say, well, actually, we're not going to be members any longer. So I think that the argument usually made for the membership is obviously that we're stronger together. There's a point about economy of scale. We're more efficient when we're together. But if we were to, for example, strengthen border controls in the UK, which is already quite...
it would follow, wouldn't it, if Britain had left the European Union? They would have left partly for this reason.
Yeah, but the border control in the UK is, that's a very, already a very big issue where a lot of money is spent on it, but probably more. So I think that on a number of the issues like immigration, police cooperation in Europe, etc., if the UK was to say we are not even going to be involved in coordinating with our European partners, then that would be very, very costly.
Sara Hagemann, thank you so much for this conversation, and good luck with your efforts to maintain a rational basis in European Union discussions.
Thank you very much. Thanks.